Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our MTA virtual mode as we finish up our year. This has certainly been a strange year. New experiences, new ways of doing things. So we've got a bunch of people on with us today, and thank you for joining us doing this virtually. The PowerPoints and all of the handouts that we're going to be referring to in class are posted online. They're in their regular location where you would find our class documents like you normally would. If you download the PowerPoint and look at it, just ignore the title. The title of the file actually says 2017. I'll fix that later today when we're done with the meeting. It is the current file, so everything is available online. Very good, thank you. So joining me today is Doug Palmer, who you all know. He's part of the OSBA team. Also Dan Grothaus. I want to say a big thanks to Dan. Dan's the supervisor at St. Mary's out in somewhere in the west side of the state, right?
Auglaize County, yes.
So Dan has been a longtime friend of OSBA and transportation. He's the supervisor, mechanic, safety person, and everything. Like many of you are for the district, you don't have just one title. So he's going to be with us for a good part of the presentation today. If you have questions as we go along, because there's enough people on here, we muted all the microphones, so you don't have to worry about noise in your background. Got a question, put it into the chat box. I'll be monitoring the chat box, and if there are things that I think is important enough that we need to break into the presentation, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll answer them on the chat box and make that all available. The video will be posted. The downside of doing things this way is I'm sorry to report there will be no chips for lunch today. So you'll have to find your own chips in your fridge. Here we go. Let me turn on my screen so that you can see me. So let me close a few windows here so that I can see what we're doing. Here we go. So we're going to be talking about, oh, by the way, a couple folks have sent me emails saying, how long will this class go today? Here's the good news. We will be done way before 2 o'clock this afternoon. In fact, our goal is somewhere around 90 minutes to 2 hours. So I expect that we'll be moving quickly and we don't want to keep you seated in one spot too long. You need to take a break. You don't even have to ask permission today. You can just get up and take a break. How about that? So things are a little different. So here's how we're going to roll the presentation today. I am going to open the presentation, go through the first couple of slides, and then Dan Grothaus is going to take over and he'll be sharing his screen. And then Doug will hop into the back side of that. And then sometime before lunch, we'll call it quits and we'll say we're done. All right, so here we go. Today we're going to talk about construction standards. We're going to talk about pre-trip inspections, preventive maintenance, the motor vehicle inspections. Of course, that's the interaction that all of us have with the State Patrol. We're going to talk about cost analysis, and that's specific to your buses. And we'll talk about life cycle assessment. That's not drivers, that's buses, all right? It's not supervisors either, it's just your buses. Let's figure out when it's time to get rid of a bus and when we don't want to keep it on hand anymore. And then we'll finish off with a little bit of conversation about bus purchasing. So here are the handouts that are available for you. I just realized that I didn't post these two rules. So I will get them posted here a little bit later this morning. This is the Ohio Administrative Code. This is the new Rule 11 and the new Rule 14. Dan and Doug will be referring to those in the presentation. I'll get them put onto our class site here a little bit later. We're going to look at bus driver inspection forms. We're going to talk about 3 or 4 laws. I call them a series, 4511.76. That's the authority for ODE to regulate operations and the patrol to regulate the vehicles. We'll refer to what's called a T30 school bus inspection form. T30 is actually a very old name. It's not a form that's used anymore, but that's a really handy tool for you. Dan will be referring to that. We'll talk a little bit about construction standards, and just a note on this next item. It used to be that the State Patrol published both an inspection manual and a bus options list. This year they decided to merge those two. Makes it a little bit harder to look up the options, but what we've done is we've posted that document for you. And then the final thing on the handouts page is a pamphlet about handrail inspections. Some of you that are fairly new to the business, you might not even know about some of the problems that happened with handrails back in the 80s. We had an incident here in Ohio where a child was getting off a bus, backpack strap got caught on a handrail in a school bus, and unfortunately the child got dragged and ultimately run over. Horrible tragedy. But what that stemmed was a wake-up call across the country. And so there's actually been a handrail handbook posted that tells you how to check to make sure your handrails are safe in your school bus. So we'll touch on that, but you also have the documents online. The first thing we want to talk about, because I want to put this on the table and I want to get it out of the way. There is a notion, it's a concept in federal law. There's a type of a school bus that's called a multi-function student activity bus. And lots of times you'll hear the manufacturers talk about a MFSAB, an MFSAB, and it's just another one of those acronyms. It's important to know that this is a school bus, but it's a subcategory of school bus. And the reason that National Highway Traffic Safety Administration rolled this out in 2003 was that's when there was a lot of concern going on nationwide about the use of vans for transporting students. And we have some states that are still using 12 and 15 passenger vans. Those are actually not legal by federal terms. Here in Ohio, we're limiting our vans to 9 passengers or less. And that's consistent with the federal law. Well, what districts were asking about and what staff across the country were asking about is, well, what if we have 12 to 15 students and we want to take them on a field trip, but we don't have enough school buses left over? How can we get them there and back and do that safely? What's a legal way to transport them? So I need to set that aside for just a second and explain something to you. There are some states in the country where all of the yellow school buses are owned actually by the state, by the Ohio Department of Education, not Ohio, but by the Department of Education in that state. North Carolina is one, South Carolina is one. And so what happens in those states is their use of the yellow school buses is highly regulated. And so those districts were struggling with, how do we take kids on field trips? Here in Ohio, it hit us because we've got, these groups of 12 and 15, and how do we take those kids on field trips? So what the feds did was they said, let's create another kind of a school bus. We want a vehicle that meets the same construction standards, but take off all the traffic control devices. So an MFSAB is a school bus. It meets every definition, every construction standard, every safety standard, except there's no red lights, there's no stop sign, you can't put the ping pong paddles on the front of it to make sure the kids cross. And here's the peculiar thing, you can actually paint it any color you want to. So what happens in North Carolina and South Carolina, if you go on vacation down there, is you will see that those are going to be white buses, and that happens in a lot of other states. Here in Ohio, you might see some white buses being operated by the boards of DD. So that's a common application for them. Boards of DD for adults. They want vehicles that meet school bus construction standards, but they're not allowed to use traffic control devices when they're loading or unloading their clients. So they're using those things. So we have this subcategory of buses that are called MFSABs. So here's where things get difficult. By law, since they don't have traffic control devices, the feds are very specific. You may not use these vehicles for home to school or school to home. In other words, it's field trip only. So if you think about, as an Ohio school district, if you want to buy buses, some of you may be thinking, well, maybe I can go out and buy a MFSAB, maybe a little bit cheaper, and we can use it for field trips. Well, here's the problem with that. Once you buy that vehicle, you can't use it for your routes. And so now you've got one bus that can only do field trips, And if you're short a bus on your routes, you can't use it. So there's really not a whole lot of advantage for our public school districts to do it. And here's the other thing that happened in Ohio. In Ohio, our school buses are built to the federal design standards. But on top of that, we add the standards that are promulgated by the Department of Public Safety through the State Highway Patrol. And so that's the Administrative Code 4501-5, sections 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we're going to talk about those in just a little bit. But in those administrative codes and in Ohio's revised code, we have language that says any school bus in Ohio has to meet every standard identically. Has to have red lights, yellow lights, has to have a stop sign. So the bottom line is what happens is that a MIFSAB is not legal for you to use as a school district. So if you have a vendor saying to you, hey, I can sell you a white bus, a field trip bus, and it's a little bit cheaper, you need to take a big pause, take a step back, because those aren't legal for us to use as a school district. You will see them in Ohio being used by daycares, because daycares aren't regulated the same way that we are. Again, I mentioned earlier, the boards of DD are using those. There have been a couple of cases where non-public schools or community schools here in Ohio have been using those white buses, and that's because they got some bad guidance from a previous administrator with state government. That has now been corrected. There's actually no legal use of a white bus for school children here in Ohio. Let's move on here. So, when we deal with school transportation in Ohio, and we'll get into 451176 a little bit later on, you know that the Ohio Department of Education is responsible for the operating standards, and the Ohio State Patrol is responsible for the construction standards. Along with the construction standards, we have standards in Ohio that talk about how we register a bus, what color it has to be, the markings on the bus. And so, I'm sure if you go on vacation, you drive into other states, you realize that up in New York, the buses look different than they do here. They paint their rub rails differently. They paint their name rails differently. So every state has its own little unique nuances. So here in Ohio, 451175 talks about school bus registration. Obviously, we don't put license plates on these buses. We do a 5-digit number, and that 5-digit number is now also preceded by the letter Q, because they started recycling some of the numbers. So here's what happens. If you get a new bus, first thing you have to do is you have to have the title to that vehicle. Then you call the state patrol. They will come out and inspect the vehicle, and they will leave you a piece of paper. It's actually the inspection form that serves as your 30-day temporary plate. You don't hang it on the bus, but you do need to keep a copy in the bus. You then will take that form, you'll fill out some registration documents. Those get sent to the BMV. They will process the license and send you the 5-digit Q number, which you then have to paint on the front of the vehicle. Again, that's a non-expiring thing. Just a side note here, if you're new as a supervisor, a couple of times to me in the field, I've been out working with crashes or accidents and have a local law enforcement officer say to me, well, where's the license plate on the bus? And we don't have license plates. We use the Q number. That's the registration number for the vehicle. Painting and marking is all standard. Obviously, they have to be yellow. They have to be marked school bus front and rear. That is hard-coded in the law. And again, 4511-771. So this section of code is important for you to know, only because this is what says we can't use an MFSAB. Because what this law says is that in Ohio, a school bus has to be yellow with black stripes, has to have signal lamps flashing red and amber, and it has to have a stop sign. And so an MFSAB does not have those things, and therefore you can't legally use those to transport students here in Ohio. All right, so what's this deal with construction standards? So school buses, and all of you remember from our rules and regs class, we talk about the laws as a hierarchy. The federal regulations come first, and then states have the authority to add to those regulations. So the way that works in the school bus world is the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration promulgates a set of guidelines that they call Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. And those are the base requirements for a school bus. They have to be met by every manufacturer for any bus that's operated anywhere in the US. Here in Ohio, we add to that. So we go one step higher than the federal standards, and we have the Ohio School Bus Construction Standards. Those are administered by the Department of Public Safety, who assigns them to be worked by the Ohio State Highway Patrol. At one point in time in Ohio, those were done by the Department of Education. Back in 1999, those were transferred over to public safety. The rationale being that public safety has always been the inspecting agency. So the legislators and administrators in charge at the time thought, well, it'll make more sense for the inspecting agency to also have control of construction standards. And by and large, that's worked for us most of the time. Within public safety, we have the state patrol, and then the specific office that manages your school bus construction standards is called the Office of Licensing and Commercial Standards. So there is a lieutenant in that office, there's now a sergeant in that office, and they oversee a group that's called the Stakeholders Construction Standards Committee. That includes folks from ODE, OSBA has staff on there, the associations have staff on there. The engineers from the manufacturers sit on that group, and that group typically meets quarterly to talk about new products, design changes, what works on a bus, what needs to be changed on a bus. And then out of that work product from that committee, we end up with a set of construction standards that are actually codified and put into law as Ohio Administrative Code. So if you go to our class site and look at the handouts, it's also on the front page of the OSBA transportation site. There's a link that takes you to the school bus construction standards. When you open those, you'll find not one, but many sets of those standards. So these standards get changed on a regular basis. And the way they work is for any bus that you own, you need to find the most recent set of standards, and that's what your bus has to meet. So if you have a bus that's a 1984 model, that bus does not need to meet a 2019 standard. It needs to meet the standards that were in place in 1984. So that's why it's important to have copies of all these rules dating back as far as we own buses. So we've done that for you. We've archived them on our website and made them available to you so you can look them up. So here are the specific parts of the construction standards so that you understand how it's separated out. It's all 4501-5. Rule 1 talks about the general provisions. In essence, what that says is here's the authority, here's what you have to do. It also stipulates the build dates, says that any buses built after the specified date in that rule have to meet the standards in place as of that date. And then the other thing it says in there, and I think Dan's got a slide on this later on, it says as an owner, we have an obligation to make sure our vehicles continue to meet those standards. So here's what's relevant about that. If you have a bus that was built in 2020 and you decide you want to change the mirrors or you want to change the seats, you have to make sure that whatever you do is at least as good as or better than the standards that were written for 2020. 4501-502, those are the specific standards, and so that's a long section. They are sorted alphabetically for the most part, and so you can go through that. Those are the things that you need to pay a lot of attention to when you are purchasing new bus, designing the buses that you want to buy. 4501-503 talks about special needs buses, and so there are some special sections in there that don't exist in 02. Specifically wheelchair restraints, wheelchair lifts. There are some safety interlocks. And then Rule 04 addresses how do we consider new products? And there's vendors coming out every day with new things that they want to sell to you. And of course they want to sell it to you. We're government. So that, appears to be an easy sell for them. But we're not allowed to put anything on a bus unless it meets and has been adopted and passed by the state patrol standards. So new products can't be put on unless you have permission. And just to be clear, you have to have that permission before you install any of that equipment on the vehicle. So just a couple of wrap-up points here before I bump us over to Dan. Here's the primary things I want you to remember. Ohio standards supplement the federal standards. To sell a bus here in Ohio, each one of the manufacturers has to write a letter to the Department of Public Safety saying they certify that their bus complies with both the federal and with the state standards. And then those buses all have to be manufactured and maintained as specified in rules 4501-502 and 03. So as long as you keep that bus, you have to meet all those standards. And just a sidebar here, you should know that an Ohio school bus is a much tougher bus to build than pretty much any other state in the country. There's only 4 or 5 states that come close to ours. So if you're ever tempted to look at used school buses, I will caution you, most buses that were built for other states will not pass the design standards here in Ohio. Dan, I think this is my last slide, so I'll hit this and then turn off and you can flip your screen on. So here's what I want you to remember for vehicle options. And all the manufacturers have a long list of things that you can buy. But I want you to remember that if it's not listed in Ohio standard or as an approved option, don't buy it. Because if it shows up on an Ohio bus, the patrol will pull the sticker off the side of the bus and you won't be able to drive it. You can test new products, but you have to get permission from the State Highway Patrol. So if you don't know how to do that, you can ask your MVI team. Ultimately, you'll end up having to work with the lieutenant here in their general headquarters in Columbus. And again, it sounds like we're reiterating, but I can't overemphasize this point. If you have unauthorized products on a bus, it invalidates the legality of that bus. And if the patrol shows up, they'll take that bus out of service. If you have a crash on that bus, because it's something you put on after the patrol inspected it, that puts you in a position of liability, and that's not where you want to be. All right, so Dan?